Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to exclusive content brought to you by SeekersGuidance. We are committed to make reliable Islamic knowledge accessible and free of charge. Help us in our mission by making a small donation at seekersguidance.org/donate. Even $10 a month can go a long way.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to episode 6 of The Art of Reading with Shaykh Ahmed Hussein Al-Azhary. Shaykh Ahmed, Jazakallah khair yet again for availing your time, putting in all this effort, to prepare these beneficial and excellent podcasts for us on this critical topic of the art of reading. Today is obviously also a sad day for us because we will be concluding our journey in the art of reading with you. But Jazakallah khair for everything that you have done in terms of putting this podcast together. In the last episode 5, you spoke about a few things. You spoke about the various levels that a student can surveil a text, superficial and deep reading. We spoke about how to analyze the various components of a text into different categories. You could look at a sentence from its propositional aspect or dimension, or you could look at the concepts within a sentence as well, and you went into detail with that. You also spoke about the various methods of verification, and then some techniques that scholars in the past utilized. What comes to mind is the technique that the Indian scholars used, where they would actually number the various predicates within a text. And then you also mentioned a technique from the Kurdish scholars as well. I think today what I would like to pose to you perhaps is how do students dissect a text with the intention of critique. Obviously this critique would be constructive more than anything else. And then the grand question, how do we put all this together? Everything that we've covered over the past few weeks in the various podcasts, how do we summate all these different theories, all these different techniques and approaches, and make the output beneficial for us as students in order to take as much as we can from a text?
Brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf, for the kind introduction. And so let's get right into the topic. I think one of the very most important steps before one delves into critiquing an author or a piece of writing is understanding the context. We talked in the previous episode about analyzing the text or dissecting the text in terms of grammar and in terms of logic. But now we're talking about the context itself, and what we mean by the context is basically when you look at a grammatically speaking, you sort of have that a micro image of the text itself. You deal with the letters, you deal with the i'rab of the words. But now in terms of context, you deal with sentences and you deal with paragraphs. So it's more of a macro image of the text itself. And actually, the best reader is the one who sort of pedals back and forth between the micro and the macro sort of levels of reading. He or she would zoom in using their grammatical skills and capacities, the malakat capacities, the grammatical capacities, and also analyzing the text in terms of logic, spotting the concepts and looking up their definitions, or actually considering the definitions posed by the author. Same thing with the propositions. But then the person would zoom out again and have a macro look at the text, which is considering the context of whatever passage or sentence the reader is analyzing. And the context is basically determined by whatever is before and whatever is after the sentence. Basically the geographical location of the statement within a paragraph, or the paragraph within a chapter, or the chapter within the whole book. So using what is before and what is after to sort of narrow down the possibilities of whatever the author meant. Many of the times we always advise that before you jump to critiquing, you asked a very important question about how do we go about constructive critique. Well, number one is make sure that you understand what the author is saying, whether you agree or disagree. But you need to understand what the author is saying himself before you get into sort of comparing what the author thinks in comparison to whatever you think about so-and-so idea. So in order to fully understand what the author is saying, you would usually go through possibilities. Perhaps he's saying this, but he's not saying it, to that extent. You sort of kind of grapple with what is he actually saying, or how far is he going with a certain topic or a certain idea. So you narrow down the possibilities of what he meant through the context. And of course, I mean, again, we touched upon this in the very early episodes of this series about the difference between the deconstructivism of the postmodern philosophies and the Islamic tradition. And in the Muslim tradition, the author is now dead, as Roland Barthes or Barthes would say. In the Islamic tradition, we're more into, not only that we cherish life more than death, but also we cherish revival. Not only that we care so much about the life of the author, intellectual life, we also care about reviving the life of the author as well. And one of the ways that we revive the author is through that sort of journey in knowing what did he actually mean. And the key tool to understand what the author meant is the context. Yes, grammar helps. Yes, logic helps as well in dissecting the text. Sometimes you would struggle grammatically in how do I do the i'rab of a certain sentence, and the context would be would be the key, would be like the torch telling you, well, the i'rab, the two different ways to do an i'rab of a certain sentence. Actually, it's the first way, for example, because the context signifies this or pushes towards this sort of grammatical understanding of the sentence. Anyways, so long story short, context is basically the key to understand what the author is trying to communicate. Now, and we said to understand the context, basically you consider what is before and what is after. Number two, before we talk about critiquing, always exclude that the author, I mean, we're talking about scholars, right? We're not talking about some kind of a blog post and you don't know who the writer is. We're not talking about like a Facebook note, all right? We're talking about a scholar, a well-versed scholar in the different sciences of the Muslim tradition or any sort of tradition. We're talking about scholar. So basically, scholars would not contradict common sense. All right. So whenever you find a sentence that does not that you find it contradicting common sense, you would have to immediately exclude that the author meant what you understand right now. You need to find out what he really meant by what he's saying. I will give you, I will not shy away. I will give you an example from a book of Turath about something that is very challenging, especially for listeners from the West. Now, Imam al-Razi in his tafsir, when he came to the verse, the verse includes خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا. All right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, basically the verse is indicating that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created for man a wife or woman, basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Eve from Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, and he created Eve for Sayyidina Adam, lakum, which means for. So Imam al-Razi, when he came to explain this verse, he used a wording that is kind of problematic in today's world. So he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created women as he created animals and plants. Alright? And in Arabic, what he said, خلق النساء كخلق الدواب والنبات. And then he sort of supported what he understood from the verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also said اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد خلق لكم ما في الأرض جميعا. And I'm afraid that I'm misquoting, but basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us what is in the world, which is basically everything that is in the world except other than ourselves. So Imam al-Razi, basically, this is what he said in the explanation of the verse. خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا. Modern readers, when they come across the sentence, they go like, how come Imam al-Razi is saying that women are like animals? Right? And actually, people were writing articles about this. How come this is a denigrating view of women? How come he's saying that? Now, when you consider the words of Imam al-Razi, and now I'm not defending his view, but also there are people who accuse Imam al-Razi that he's making a simile between women and animals. So there are two things. There is one point of view, which is, are women created for men? That's one topic, that's a concept, that's a proposition by Imam al-Razi that we can question and examine. And then there's another issue, which is a simile of women and animals. And people accuse him of that. So when you find Imam al-Razi, what he's actually saying, when you dissect the sentence, what he said خلق, and he said that this verse says that خلق النساء كخلقي. So he's saying the creation of women is like the creation of animal and plants. He's not saying women are like animals. All right? So what he is comparing is the act of God, not the creatures. He's comparing the creation of the Creator, not the creatures themselves, whether women or animals. And the context is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these verses, he's mentioning blessings that were given, all right, to mankind. And it's agreed upon within the Muslim creed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam first. So basically, what Imam al-Razi is saying, I understand from this verse, just as the other one, where we understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us everything that is on this planet. Animals, plants, you name it. Everything that is there is a blessing. Therefore, linguistically, I also understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created women for men as a blessing. Now comes another question. Does that necessitate that women and animals are on the same level? No, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as in other verses, has blessed mankind with prophets. Does that make a simile? Wal-'iyadhu billah? Of course not. All right. So again, I'm not the role of this episode, and we're not here to defend Imam al-Razi, but what I want the reader to pay attention of, there's a fine line between accusing Imam al-Razi of denigrating women and, on the other hand, critiquing Imam al-Razi's view that women were created for men. Because there is a Mufassir, his name is Nizam al-Din al-Naysaburi, who wrote a tafsir, an exegesis after Imam al-Razi, and he was during I think he was a contemporary of Imam Jalal-ud-Din al-Dawani. And Naysaburi was sort of, how would I say this? He was kind of, he always likes to, I felt like when he was writing his tafsir, that he has the tafsir of Imam al-Razi in front of him, and like he sometimes like takes certain aspects from Imam al-Razi, sometimes he would reject certain opinions of Imam al-Razi without mentioning his name, and at other points he would say Imam al-Razi said so and so and I support it, and in other parts he would say Imam al-Razi said so and so and I reject it. So when he came to this verse, he did not mention Imam al-Razi, but he mentioned the opinion, and he disagreed with Imam al-Razi. He said, I don't agree that women were created for men, but that does not exclude that women are a blessing for men. But they were not created for them in a sense that there is a primary being and then there is a secondary being in that sense. So he disagreed with Imam al-Razi. But see, Nizam al-Din Naysaburi did not accuse Imam al-Razi of cursing out women, for example, or comparing women to animals or saying that they are animals. He understood what al-Razi is trying to say. Al-Razi is trying to say that men were created before women, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to men that women are a blessing for them. So he kind of understood that they were that then there's a primary and a secondary. So he disagreed with Imam al-Razi, but he understood that Imam al-Razi is posing an understanding of a verse, but not cursing, not denigrating, not saying all women are are like animals. He's not saying that. So now this, if you follow this practical example where it shows how certain letters, خلق النساء ك, he did not say خلق النساء كالدواب, he said خلق النساء كخلق الدواب. All right. And then when you read Imam al-Razi in other contexts, where in the verses that talks about the importance of mercy between the husband and wife, he goes extensively about the importance of being merciful to women and and their important role, basically, that without them life would not have been feasible. All right. So that is not somebody talking about as if they're like animals. So that is important sometimes, that understanding what the author is saying before you critique the author. Before you critique the author, exclude that a grand scholar is contradicting common sense. Common sense says that a grand scholar would not curse out women in an exegesis of the Quran. You get the point? So there must be something, and that ought from the reader is to do research. Fetch the other verses that are talking about the relationship between the husband and wife, that are talking about women, so on and so forth. Read other exegesis or commentaries that follow Imam al-Razi and try to critique Imam al-Razi and see how they understood. All right, because they themselves, like for example, Nizam al-Din Naysaburi, and that's when I told you that he was opening Mafatih al-Ghaib, the Imam al-Razi's book of tafsir in front of him. The reason I mentioned him is that he was keen to critique Imam al-Razi whenever he finds Imam al-Razi, following an opinion that deserves to be critiqued. You get the point? So one should not reinvent the wheel. If a certain work has already been critiqued, and you feel that the author has contradicted common sense, guess who is the first person to accuse him of this? The early critiques. So if all the early critiques are not bringing this up, do you think that like the consensus of these scholars, they all missed the point? That's kind of far fetched. You know what I mean? So like a rule of thumb, don't consider that the author is contradicting common sense. There must be something in there. There's a twist. there's something that is meticulous that I'm not paying attention to. All right? I apologize that I went into details of this, but this is a very fine example, because I read two articles that are published in the Arab world, one by a modernist, and the other one who by an author that sort of towards I don't know how to put this, but one author is a modernist, and the other is sort of taking a harsh view towards the tradition. So basically, two people coming from different standpoints, yet reading the text the same way. Imam al-Razi is, denigrating women. All right. So I apologize for getting into that, but I think it was a practical example, so people could use it as an analogy. At the end of the day, one could agree with Imam al-Razi or disagree, but it's very important that when you are critiquing somebody, that you are being spot on the critique itself. All right. Now, moving to the aspects of critique, one could look towards the notion of critiquing an author, like how certain young students, they deal with critique as a notion of enjoining good and forbidding evil. Amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy al munkar. And others deal with, and one would not really benefit from that. And others deal with the notion of critique more of as a learning experience. So Allama Hamid al-Ghifari says, this is the way you do critique. After you understood what the author meant, you start considering the critiques that you can bring about in terms of the tasawurat, in terms of the concepts, the definitions. Did he make any mistake, or did he commit any fallacy in the way he defined the concept? And you do the same thing with the propositions. Did he commit any fallacy? But then, after you find the fallacy, what do? You play the role of the advocate of the author. So you critique your critique. And then you critique the critique of the critique. And Allama Hamid al-Ghifari says, and also Shaykh Ahmed El Azhary, the longer this process becomes, the more well-versed the reader will become as well, in terms of the text and in terms of the subject and the discipline itself. So you go back and forth between critiquing the author and then becoming an advocate of the author, and then critiquing what the advocate says, and you create a dialogue, basically, and now you could see that this sort of contextual reading does bring the text to life. You don't have to believe that the author is dead. You don't have to exclude the context. You don't have to exclude linguistics. You don't have to exclude, considering the background of the author when you're interpreting what he meant. You don't have to exclude all these things. Actually, just creating a dialogue with the text through the critiquing back and forth. So that is basically, in a nutshell, how back in the Muslim tradition, how they used to do critiquing back and forth. Now we come to the final question. Okay, we practiced all of these sort of skill set. What do we do? Well, there are certain there's a group of advice, and I'll give them like in a sort of bullet points. There are certain things that one ought to do during this process so one could benefit from it. Number one, writing. If you don't have a notepad, if you're not writing down this sort of interaction, if you're not recording your interaction with the text. So a reader is a reader, but at the same time he's a historian of his own reading. So you need to record it. You need to write down your interaction. Even when you change your thoughts about things, what made you consider that he's not saying A and he's saying B? What made you consider that? So you need to record these things, all right? In an orderly fashion as much as possible. And of course, note taking is that's a whole different thing, but use whatever note taking technique that you prefer, but basically you have to take notes, and you take notes in the form of a historian, all right? Dealing with, jotting down the interaction with the text. So this is one thing. The other, don't use a highlighter. Especially if you are, a beginner. Because as a beginner, guess what? What deserves to be highlighted is the whole book. All right? As a beginner, you don't know what is important from what is not important. So I never seen somebody as a beginner highlight a book, and then when they grow in knowledge, they open the book, the manual that they studied in a young age or at a starting level. They, what did I do to the book? Why did I highlight all of these sentences? All right. So you find so this is one thing, all right, because you don't highlight the book because you don't know yet what is important and what is not important. Actually, being a beginner in reading, you are still exploring how do you determine what is important and what is not important. This is something that you need to develop as you build your reading capacity. So it's too early to be saying what is important and what is not important. Number two is that highlighting gives you an impression that you studied. So when you highlight, you have this impression, so I read, I studied, see, I highlighted and so on and so forth. But if you don't use the pen, if you don't, and when I mentioned note taking in the previous point, I meant note taking with a pen, not note taking on some kind of electronic gadget, because that helps the memory much more. So highlighting gives you the impression that you studied, but in fact you did not. Number three is that you work out diagrams for what you're reading. And I saw myself manuscripts, and I saw early prints of written books in balagha and in language, where scholars would use diagrams in the margins. So those who wrote super commentaries, hawashi, they would include diagrams. All right. So feel free to use a diagram, but make sure not to confuse a concept map with a mind map. A mind map, you can use that to brainstorm an outing, all right, an event. Brainstorm a short story that you want to write for an English literature class, all right? Brainstorming, basically. But in the Muslim tradition, disciplines are hierarchical. So they use the notion of concepts, universals and particulars. So it goes from top to bottom. Mind maps, they don't necessarily emphasize a priority or a level of universals and particulars. So use the diagrams in the form of a concept map, not a mind map. All right. Play around with the colors. That's not something that I really investigated. But the notion, the whole point is, don't confuse the concept map with the mind map. That's something important. Okay. So now I have a concept map. I have a notes that I jotted down. There's something else to mention, is develop your own indices of the book as well. All right. These indices could later on become research papers. And I learned this from one of my shuyukh who was working on an edition of a sharh on Sahih al-Bukhari. And he was asked to create he created a volume of indices. So he got very creative with the indices. So for example, he would create an index whenever the author would say, and in this topic there is a consensus, ijma', for example. So he had an index of all the parts of all the the location of every time the author said, and in this matter there is a consensus of opinions, for example. You could do the opposite whenever he says there is khilaf. I mean, you can become very creative with it. You can use certain expressions and see how many times the author has written that sort of, one of my shuyukh was just recently telling me that Imam al-Haramain Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni in the Nihayat al-Matlab often would say وَمَقْصَدُ الْبَاب, all right, and the objective of this chapter is so and so. So one, as he reads Imam al-Juwayni, whenever he reads وَمَقْصَدُ الْبَاب, would jot down the page number. And my Indian sheikh would tell me, you do this not in the separate notepad. The notepad is for as we said, for the interaction with the text. But basically, you would write down inside, like in the back cover or something of that sort, where there is a flip or there's an empty page within the book itself. So when the book is stored or placed on a bookshelf, whenever you hold it and you open up, you find your own index. So you can play around with things. It could be by words, it could be by certain topics. So you create certain indices. And sometimes you would find yourself like an index that you created, an author talked about whatever topic for the index that you chose 20-30 times. And that means you got 30, maybe 40 quotes on a certain subject by one author. That could be turned into a master's degree. You get the point? Mm-hmm. That could be a thesis about the author so and so and his a position towards da-da-da. You get my point, all right? Basically, these indices are there for you as data that you could use later on for research papers. What do I do with the notes? Couple of things. One, share them. And what I mean by sharing them, not like taking pictures of them and posting them on Instagram. What I mean by sharing the notes is basically after you kind of like obviously when you jot down notes, you're jotting them in a quick fashion, so you try to type them up or anything of that sort. Organize them basically, whether written by pen or on electronically. But what I mean by sharing them is discussing your notes with a fellow, with a learning partner basically, or with a sheikh, all right, whatever is available. Sometimes though, and this is a key, and they actually said this in the manuals of Adab al-Mutala'a, they said you don't go immediately to the sheikh. What you do is, whenever you grapple with a topic, you think it over. After you think it over, you go to your classmates, you go with your learning partners, and you discuss it with them. And then, in the end, you go to the sheikh. And when you go to the sheikh, you narrate to him what you did with the topic. So I was reading so-and-so, and I grappled with this topic, and I thought it over, and to me, there are two possibilities. So when there were two possibilities in understanding what he was trying to say, I talked with my fellows, and we discussed things, and one of them proposed this and the other proposed that. So what do you think? So that is a question, all right? You narrated to him your experience with the book, all right? Sometimes that sheikh, if he's not available for you to read with you the text, but at least that sort of interaction enhances the short periods that you have access to him. All right. So maybe you don't have an access to read the whole book with the sheikh, but at least when you have questions, you go with a very fine-tuned questions that narrate your experience, so you can tailor an answer to the question that is very suitable for you. All right. And also, it gives him an impression of your level in terms of this book, because the question is indicative of how much you understand, more than your answers to his questions, by the way. And they mentioned this in the biographies. They would say that they used to spot the smart student from the smart students from their questions, not from their answers. They say that the questions of students are the best indicator of their dispositions, their intellectual dispositions. All right? So you share the notes with your fellows and with your sheikh. All right? Throughout this experience, you will find often that projects pop up in your head. Whether a certain topic that needs to be enhanced, that needs to be studied in a comparative fashion, that maybe you need to do some kind of a tracing of a certain thought or idea or a group of ideas in a certain book or books of one author or multiple authors. These sort of ideas will pop up as you do that, as you work your way through this sort of reading. I went on and on in this final episode, and I apologize into getting into all these sort of details. It's a lot in that sort of final episode, but I hope at least if they're not illustrative enough to the listeners, but at least they could give them some kind of an idea from where to start, from where to work on developing these sort of skills. And if I would want to end with a certain thought on, like with a certain advice, and have it as the final advice, and I apply it myself, and they actually mention it also in the books. As a reader, you often find understandings or meanings that you could say, meanings that come up to you as you read immediately, like in hindsight. Like when you read, it's the very first thing that comes to your mind, or it's the very obvious. All right? Try as much as possible to work as much as possible on negating the obvious, but in a simulating. All right? Simulate that you're asked to negate the obvious meaning. So I read a sentence, and once I finish it, you find a certain meaning that pops up in your mind. All right? Do your best, all right, in trying to figure out how could I work my way through, how would I work my reading through this sentence to negate this obvious meaning. Just simulate this, all right? This trains your mind to be creative as you read, all right? It would not necessarily every time work. It might lead you to a wrong understanding. That's why I said simulate it, and this is very important. Simulate that, all right? But it makes you very well trained in narrowing down meanings when you simulate the negation of the obvious. All right. So this is just an advice that I would give in the end when you're reading books. If you have any final thoughts or questions, since this is our goodbye, unfortunately, and I enjoyed it so much, alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah khair. Shaykh Ahmed, I would personally like to take this opportunity in thanking you. It's been a phenomenal series. We've benefited so much, and the feedback that I've received from students around the globe has been only positive. Some students who have contacted me personally, the remarks were such that we wish that we had this podcast or this type of discussions made available earlier to them. And I mean, these students are in different fields, so I mean, people have definitely benefited from this podcast. And what I would like to request from the audience out there that has been listening, or have been listening over the past few months, is to make dua and supplications for Shaykh Ahmed. He's taken much out of his time here in Cairo to be with us on a consistent and regular basis. Much preparation has gone into this podcast. You might not see it because it's audio, but Shaykh Ahmed is prepared, extremely well for these sessions, and we'd just like to say thank you to him for that. Our thanks and our gratitude will never be able to do justice. So even though this is a sad occasion, as we've mentioned, and Shaykh Ahmed has said as well, some good news is that we have a few other projects in the pipeline with Seekers, inshallah, with Shaykh Ahmed. Inshallah, just to let the cat out of the bag, we'd be looking at recording a more broader and general subject in the form of the art of learning, which would cover various other components: the art of asking a question, the art of reading in a bit more detail, and a few other things as well. And this would most probably be in a video format. Sure. And then also a potential course on intellectual Islamic history. So we will see Shaykh Ahmed, inshallah, in the near future. This is not the final end, but just the end to the podcast, inshallah. So please make dua for Shaykh Ahmed and everyone else involved. I'd just like to say thank you to the supporting team, Nabiel, Mohammed and Masood Hayat, who have done excellent work behind the scenes to have made this program possible as well. So Jazakallah khair. Shaykh Ahmed, thank you yet again. Remember us in your du'as, and I'm sure all the listeners out there will remember you and your family, inshallah, for everything that you have done. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for listening to The Art of Reading, and we hope that you join us soon in the near future. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you for listening. This lesson was brought to you by SeekersGuidance, the world's first truly global Islamic seminary. Visit SeekersGuidance.org to access reliable Islamic knowledge taught by qualified teachers. We offer a wide range of courses, podcasts, articles, and a world-class answer service, all completely free of charge. This is made possible solely by supporters like you. Be a partner in this blessed work by making a small donation at SeekersGuidance.org/donate. Even $10 a month can go a long way. Our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "Whoever guides someone to goodness will have a similar reward." So don't forget to share this lesson and join us in spreading prophetic guidance.